I've been asked to cover the EU regulatory perspective on risk communication with PML. I know time is short, so I will move fairly briskly through my slides. This first slide just gives an overview of what I'd like to cover. I'd like to start with some general observations on the framework for risk communication in the EU from a regulatory perspective, before moving on to particular challenges with PML. Some examples particularly focusing on Tisabri, but also mentioning one or two others in relation to what's been done so far, what seems to be working, and what perhaps what could be better in terms of knowledge gaps. I want to touch just on at the end on measuring success and some thoughts on where we might go with that, and finally some future directions from a strategic point of view. Before launching into discussing PML, I think it's worth just reflecting on what the purpose of risk communication is for healthcare professionals and patients, and I've summarised what I think are the main points on this slide. First of all, of course, it's to help people decide whether the medicine is the right choice for them. Secondly, it's perhaps to advise on safe and appropriate use of medicine, to describe risks quantitatively and qualitatively. Importantly, to advise them what to do in the event of problems, and we've heard how important that is with PML. When to stop treatment and whether to stop treatment. So those are my five main aims, if you like, of risk communication. And I think the important point I want to make from this is that in order to achieve that, and certainly in order to make the decision about starting and stopping treatment, you need to put risk in the context of benefit. So really what we should be talking about is benefit risk communication at all times. Now I put this slide up because, well, partly because I just like the picture, and partly because it reminds me that whilst it's easy to state the aims of benefit and risk communication, it's not always easy to deliver in an effective way. Why? Well, the concepts, both in terms of qualitatively and quantitatively, are quite difficult at times. And as we've heard already this morning, there may be differing perspectives. The patient level perspective may be different from the societal or the population level. And there may be different perceptions about what is an acceptable risk, based on experience or even personality. So turning to the EU and what we have in our armamentarium, what are our tools to work with in terms of benefit and risk communication? Well, we have a variety of tools and documents, and apologies for the slightly busy slide, but at the time of initial licensing, we have the standard regulatory documents, the summary of product characteristics, the patient information leaflet. We have an assessment report for European products, and we have a risk management plan. We also have documents which are used in the post-licensing phase, and these are largely based on updates for safety reasons for existing documents, particularly the risk management plan and the patient information and the summary of product characteristics. But also we have some ad hoc communications such as Dear Healthcare Professional communications and question and answer documents, and these are always supported, or usually supported, by appropriate press releases and press briefings. And then there's some additional ad hoc materials which may be used in certain occasions, reminder cards and information sheets. And then national communications, which are done, for example, the MHRA has a monthly bulletin called Drug Safety Update, which includes what we consider to be the most important new advice for prescribers. And then not to forget international publications such as the WHO. Worth just reflecting on how good and how effective these tools are, or how well adapted they are to benefit risk communication. And I would say that there are some very good examples of effective benefit risk communication in the EU, but it's also worth perhaps conceding that our templates currently are not always best adapted for this task. I won't go through this in great detail, but just to say, in terms of benefit, if one considers the SBCs and the pills, the patient information leaflets, there is no point for a very clear summary on expected benefits, the magnitude of those benefits, and the uncertainties around them. There are sections within these documents which allow a little bit of information, but there's no, if you like, very clear and full summary on that. Likewise for risks, sometimes the qualitative description of risks, seriousness and outcomes in particular, is lacking in these documents. And there's scope for some confusion perhaps over descriptions of statistical probability. Terms like rare and common are easily misinterpreted or interpreted differently by different people. And there's often an absence of baseline risk and information about uncertainty, and indeed what to do when one comes across problems. So going forward, we may need to think about newer templates and better guidance. But I just want to mention one thing which I think is a very helpful thing going forward in the EU, and that is a recent update to our public assessment report templates, which allows for a very clear description of benefits and uncertainties, risks and uncertainties, and then putting the two things together to form a balance. Now moving to PML and the subject of today, of course. So what are the particular challenges that we've faced in general with PML? Well, obviously putting risk in the context of benefit is a key challenge. Qualitative description, how best to describe it for healthcare professionals and importantly patients without being alarmist. How to describe the risk quantitatively, making sure we use the best possible evidence, cognizant of the fact there may be underreporting of adverse drug reaction reports, making the best use of evidence from studies. Describing how risk changes with duration of use, considering individual risk factors which we've already heard about, such as immunosuppression. So all of those are challenges, as is the early description of early symptoms. We've heard how subtle the early symptoms can be, so it's important to get clear advice on that. The consequences of PML and iris and the probabilities associated with that are, of course, important. And finally, we're given such a range of different areas to cover, keeping everything up to date with an emerging and changing field of data and ensuring that all the documents are consistent is, of course, a challenge. So with Tysabri, one of the most important things to say, I think, is that there is a wide range of documents that have been developed in regard to risk communication on PML. There are, of course, updates, and there have been frequent updates to the summary of product characteristics and the patient information leaflet. And these have frequently been accompanied by ad hoc communications, such as press releases and questions and answer documents. These are documents which are designed, obviously, the SBC for the professionals and the leaflet for the patients. That there are other targeted documents as well. The physician information, educational materials on the management of PML and the stratifications of risk. The patient information is expanded with the use of a card, which I'll come on to in a moment. And there are initiation and continuation forms which allow a discussion and encourage a discussion between patients and the healthcare professional at the initiation of treatment and after 2 years to ensure there's a clear understanding of what the benefits and risks are at those time points. And then we've already heard a little bit about website information, and there is some information available on websites, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Going into the detail, a little bit of information which I've shown on this slide is from the patient information leaflet on Tysabri, and I wanted to emphasize that it's very good that it actually includes some information about benefit. Quite often, patient information leaflets in Europe don't include very much information about benefit, but here it's clearly important. And you can see some information from clinical trials, and there's an explanation that benefit may be seen as the absence or the lack of deterioration. And it's important that patients appreciate what that actually means. Is there room for improvement? Well, possibly in terms of portraying or describing the variance in the clinical data. That is the individual variation and the range of possibilities in terms of benefit for individual patients. Perhaps more work could be done on that. Here's an extract from the section on the patient information leaflet regarding PML itself. And a lot of detail is included, and that's a good thing, of course. And a lot of honest and quite straightforward facts and figures or statements. I've underlined the bits I wanted to highlight. These are not actually highlighted in this way in the actual document, but there's a description in terms of quantitative risk, rare, although one can argue that that varies according to particular risk groups. There's a clear statement about the possible consequences in terms of severe disability and death, and there's also a reference to iris and the serious implications of that. So all of that detail is important, and it's good that it's there. Is there anything else that we can expect from this sort of information? Well, I think an overall expectation of outcomes is lacking, and that's we've heard earlier on today in previous talks that we don't have very often the information on outcomes, and more data needs to be collected there in order to give patients and healthcare professionals a clear idea. So people can actually say with some degree of certainty what are the chances of death overall, what are the chances of serious disability, mild disability or recovery, and how then you can balance that against the benefits. An important development has been the the notion that one can stratify risk according to various risk factors. And in particular, we've heard about the possibility of testing for an anti-JCV antibody, the use of prior immunosuppressants, and the duration of treatment as key determinants to the overall risk. And this slide shows an algorithm which is working its way towards educational materials in the EU, and will be helpful in terms of informing discussions between patients and healthcare professionals about where they sit in the overall risk stratum. A few caveats: of course, we have to be careful about the sensitivity and specificity of tests such as the anti-JCV antibody tests. We have to be careful about generalizations about immunosuppressant use. What does that mean? Is one immunosuppressant perhaps more significant than another in terms of presenting a risk? And the precision around the risk estimates, we have to be careful about. How precise are they? So there's some caveats here, but nevertheless, this is a useful approach, I think, as we go forward. And as we learn more, it will be helpful to expand these algorithms and make them even more precise. Quick word about early warning symptoms, and we've heard already how important that can be in terms of outcomes. And therefore, it's a good thing that there is a patient information card which highlights some of the subtle early changes that can be important for patients, their carers and families to know about and to report early. And you can see them listed on the left-hand side of this card. A few words about some other drugs than PML, and we've heard already that the absolute risk with other drugs is perhaps lower. This is an extract from one of our drug safety update articles here in the UK from 2009, and it highlights some of the drugs and some of the areas where PML has been associated, and those drugs for which there is information in the summary of product characteristics. And just to concentrate on a few of them, just for information, we've heard about these drugs already today: rituximab, MabThera, aflibercept, fludarabine is just one example I just chose, plucked from the others. And the thing that strikes me immediately is there's a very wide range of indications from leukemias and lymphomas, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, which we've already heard about Raptiva. What are the challenges with these drugs? Well, we've already heard there's much less research and much less known, therefore, about the relative and absolute risks and the risk factors in these cases. And the implications for overall benefit risk will vary according to the indication. And we've heard that Raptiva was withdrawn after just 3 cases being reported of PML. There, the indication was moderate to severe psoriasis, and the usage was obviously much, much lower than with some of the other drugs. In general, what can I say about the information that's available for these other drugs? Well, much less, I would say, than is the case for Tisabri. Not surprising, perhaps, given the relative rarity of PML with these cases. But just for information, I show on this slide some of the extracts from patient information leaflets. The top half of the slide shows what was said about in the efalimumab, the Raptiva patient information leaflet before it was withdrawn. The bottom half is what's in the current MabThera patient information leaflet. But I should say also there is a card for MabThera as well, similar to the approach that's being taken for Tisabri. Perhaps not surprising, as I said, that there's not so much information here, but I think one of my key thoughts here is that maybe there's some core messages that should be distilled and used in common for each of these products whenever one's talking about PML. So, for example, with a patient card reminding about early symptoms, it would perhaps be sensible to harmonise that with the best possible practice. Why have one saying one thing and one saying anything different? Very quickly on to websites. We've heard already the importance of real-time data, and transparency is of course an important thing. You can see from this slide, it's very much modern life is all about being as transparent as possible. But it is important also to make sure that when information is presented on websites, that it is meaningful. It's not just a data dump. So it will be important as we move forward, whether it's a vigilance database or whether it's company databases and so on, that information is presented in a way which patients and healthcare professionals can use, and it's not just a raw presentation of data. How should we think about measuring success? Well, we should think about it as it's the first thing to say with risk communication. Are healthcare professionals and patients better informed? We can ask them. We can do surveys. We can test the value and the value of an understanding of the materials we put out there, and that should be done. Are there better outcomes? Difficult to ascribe those just to communication tools, but if there is earlier recognition of symptoms, that may be something which we can measure and relate to changes in mortality and morbidity. Obviously, PML rates themselves may be reduced partly by better informed decisions on starting and stopping treatment, and research could be aimed in that direction too. My conclusions then: risk communication should always be benefit risk communication. I think that applies across the board, but particularly for PML. Communications do need to be targeted, and it's important to involve patient groups and professional groups in developing the materials, and there's been much good work already into SABRI. There are still some gaps in our knowledge, and as a result, we can't always get everything we want into the product information, particularly about outcomes and balancing benefits and risks and the uncertainties. Websites can be useful, and there's a question mark there only in the terms of the fact that we just need to make sure that the information is presented in a useful way. Product information for other drugs is generally limited, but we can think about perhaps some core elements that should be there for all of them, and we need to think about testing. Finally, some strategic thoughts for the future. There may be the possibility of changes to the EU legislation which will enhance our regulatory tools in terms of benefit risk communication. There are other initiatives ongoing at the moment. The Innovative Medicines Initiative and the EMA Initiative on Benefit Risk may give us graphical tools for better communicating risks. And finally, use of media and technologies will help us transmit those to people in enhanced and perhaps real time. I'll leave you with one of my favorite examples of benefit risk communication. Thank you.